Software as a service is dead. Here's what to do instead. While I do think this is overblown to some extent, I do think there's real threat here to the SaaS business model. So I agree with that. Of course, it's always more nuanced than that. But I came across this newsletter article. It's called Context is King, and it's by The Leverage, a very great newsletter, by the way. So I'm not affiliated, but I really like Evan and his writing. And he essentially was making an argument of 3-layer stack, where SaaS, what it really is some sort of UI and some sort of system of record, some sort of database, right? And all you do, I mean, there's more to it, but all you do really is you operate the UI to manipulate the data store. And he's making the argument that there is a new context layer, which is institutional knowledge, process logic, and also things that, I added in my take on this that I'm going to share you in a second. But this used to be done by people, right? So people would go in and they would know, okay, if I need to do a sales call, I go into the CRM and I load up all the context on that customer that I have so that I can have a good conversation. That would be done by people, right? And that's what I needed SaaS for, because I needed a place to store all this stuff. But I want to take this a tiny bit further, because internally we're doing a lot of AI work, obviously, and we're also building ventures here. So we have to think about, long-term defensibility of things. And this is exactly why the SaaS stocks are being sold, because people are now kind of scared that long-term that stuff will go away. And so how I see it, I essentially just took the context layer and I extended it, because context layer for me isn't the right word, just because context for me is just one piece of that layer and there's others, and context is also, if we're talking AI, it's just a very specific word within AI. So that's why I thought, I don't know. I don't love the name, the value layer, honestly, but I couldn't come up with anything better for now. So here we go. So I see it is that, we have point solution applications, so that's the same, but we have SaaS products. We maybe even have generated UIs that are being generated on the fly, right? We have chat interfaces, we just have Cloud Code, we have agents as point solution applications. Could be temporary, could be a SaaS like UI that we built because it makes sense to have a stable UI and a stable workflow. And then we have system of record. So that I left the same. Ultimately, also models should become, commodities, which means they're more or less like electricity utilities, right? That's the idea. Of course, we need to see, because there's also a risk that there's not enough electricity to go around to make them a utility, right? So essentially, they're built on other utilities, which is interesting. And they need to all work out for it to become a utility, right? All right. But yeah, that's a different problem to be solved. And so how I see it, context is data and knowledge, right? So what gets fed into the model at some point in some way. So we have, with Cloud Code, we have skills. I have different videos on this stuff if you're not familiar with the terms, but we have skills, which can be just markdown files, or they can be, Python scripts. And then we give them all, ideas how to do a certain task, right? We have MCPs, we have datasets that are part of our domain expertise. If we have that in-house, or, we buy them somewhere. We have external knowledge and RAG, doesn't really matter. But these are all things that go, into the context. That's, for me, is what I understand as context, right? In the LLM sense. And then we have prompting, which is instructions and behavior, right? So we have system prompts, we have configurations, we have a library of prompts, we have, skill instructions. So I guess we split skills here between the prompt piece and just the extra layer of content within a skill. So if I create a skill, I can, I will write a prompt. This is what your job is. And then I say, here's some extra context, domain expertise, how we usually do things, which is the whole workflow piece, right? So this is how we do outreach. This is how we do this other thing. And that will always be specific to the domain that you're in and your internal process that you now basically, abstracted into a workflow file, a text. And then we have a programmatic approach. And that is essentially event-driven logic that dynamically shapes context and behavior. So we have, hooks. We can extend the agent, the harness, the LLM with, a kind of plugin approach, a dynamic context injection. We have sub-agents. We have system reminders, conditional routing. So these are more ultimately technical things that make the LLM, for example, remind itself to do something so that it does a better job at producing a deliverable, right? And so really all this is saying, okay, let's not compete, for example, with Claude Code on building the best harness for an agent, but how can we extend the harness with something that is ultimately more defensible? Because Claude Code will probably, or Codex or whatever, doesn't matter. I mean, there might be others, will probably always have the best harness unless you need something very, very specific for your use case. But it's probably a better bet to extend that harness in the short to medium term and to see what is Moat there. And the technical piece, I think, is less defensible. So everything that's over here, the programmatic stuff, I think what's most, so this is like low defensible. This is like maybe medium defensible. And this is, I think, where defensibility lies, just because you will have a very certain, a very certain opinion on how to do things. And I think ultimately the most important will be the data sets. So how, and these are really the takeaways here. What data do you have that only you have, or is very hard to get, right? That, for example, OpenAI or Claude or whoever, Anthropic, will not try to replicate or not try to get because it's just too expensive to do or impossible, right? Without licensing it from you, for example. And so this is something, this is really the only thing you can defend long term is if it's really, really proprietary. And so it's about thinking about how can you build those data sets, and they can be both built from essentially your existing data by running. If you have a service business, for example, you might already have a certain process you're selling, which you have a lot of data on the result, or you just build it like OpenAI built their data set by scraping, for example, which isn't super defensible, but it's also more friction to replicate, right? So it comes in layers. And I think ultimately it is building a sort of, a data set that will just not be replicated or is hard to replicate. And then the second is a feedback loop within the product. So once you have a data set and you make that available, how can you refine the data set or build a separate data set that, has synergies that will be built on top of the usage? And then obviously you need to connect it to the LLM by either, building a skill or, building an MCP, which isn't the hard piece, right? Like I can build that in 5 minutes, or I can make a skill in 5 minutes. And then of course, I need to make it better over time. But the underlying data is really what's important. And I think, while you might get away with building SaaS for a very specific use case for the next half year, I don't think it will be, long-term defensible. And what's good about this value layer is essentially, and this is the tiered structure, right? You can just build another UI or agent or whatever on top of it, because it's just an LLM extension, and whatever product can use your LLM will be able to benefit from it. So yeah, if you think in similar ways, or if you think I'm, talking out of my ass, feel free to let me know. But yeah, so this is how I think about it.